The title of my conference is Punk from Mexico, BIPOC Realities and Intersectional Struggles. For those who do not know what BIPOC means means Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So this is, from this perspective, is from which I am talking. When we talk about punk, I try to always contextualize and also to look a little bit back for those who do not have or do not know a lot about the topic. Punk, in the history of punk has a cross-border background. There is a debate about where exactly punk actually began. Some people say it was with the Psychos, with the track Demoler, which you can find online in '64. Other people will say it's the Stooges from Michigan with their project that began in '67. Other people will say, like, no, it was Death, the Afro-American band Death from Detroit, who began playing in '71. The more mainstream history of punk says that it was the Ramones from New York City who began playing in '74. And mostly of the people say that it was the Sex Pistols from London who started playing in '75. I personally go for the take of Los Psychos because their track Demoler is a fantastic hymn to what actually punk culture means. However, I have a further thesis, which is that the grandmother of rock and punk is actually a Black Afro-American woman, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who was playing in '64. She was doing a concert, a live concert in England. And this concert changed forever the history of music because she influenced what later will become rock and what later will become punk rock and what later also became punk. And this because the way she was playing electric guitar, all the riffs, all the noise comes actually from Sister Rosetta Tharpe. So when I talk about BIPOC from a BIPOC perspective, that this is exactly what I mean, which is rescuing, bringing to the history archives all those BIPOC characters that have been neglected and that are not that do not get the acknowledgement that they actually should get. And one of them is Sister Rosetta Tharpe. I think she is the grandmother of rock and punk culture. But now let's go back to specifics, to the specific context that I choose for this conference, which is Mexico. And I want to explain to you the context basically on expressing the system of beliefs of what that Mexico has. And in order for you to understand why punk culture has been so fruitful and so important in Mexico. First of all, Mexico, as many of you know, is an ex-Spanish colony. We were colonized by the Spanish people. It is mainly, therefore, it is mainly a Catholic country. It has an incredibly diverse indigenous population. Mostly is white and mestizo dominance. If you don't know what mestizo means the mixture between Spanish people and indigenous people having children together. It does not matter if it is the result of a rape. What matters is that there are children that have both cultural backgrounds. That's the mestizo culture. And in the case of Mexico, Mexico is an incredibly mestizo country. Mostly of Mexicans are actually mestizo. But we have also white, and there is also the indigenous population. Mexico is an incredibly racist and classist country with its racist and classist structures. Mexico, we tend to say as a satire that Mexico is very far from God, but incredibly close to the United States. And if you explore a little bit colonialism and imperialism, I am sure that you will understand what this means. It's not a positive thing. It could be in certain things, but in terms of colonialization, that's the new colonialization, the United States. Subcultures in the context of Mexico are normally a target by the police and for militaries. And I think it's not only for Mexicans. I believe that this happens a lot in Asia, for instance, with all the punks in the Asian diaspora. I think they also have a lot of problems with the police and the military hunting subcultures. The origins. I always like to portray movements or cultural movements or cultural expressions via the history of music, and always go back a little bit in order to understand and contextualize better. The origins are actually a response to the 60s. That was the origin of punk culture. And in the case of Mexico, it's not different. As we know, in the United States, there was this incredibly music festival called Woodstock, which happened in '69. And this is, I think, the first huge music festival that happened in the United States. And some Mexicans were actually there and were heard about it, were there, and brought actually the influence of this festival to the Mexican context. And Mexicans, what they did 2 years later was to build up and to produce basically their own festival called Avándaro. And this was a music festival in El Valle de Bravo in Mexico. And it was also an incredibly huge festival in which you had a lot of freedom, exploration in sexuality, drugs, a completely math festival as well. And these two festivals are actually the background of punk culture as well. The first punk wave. When we talk about the history of punk, I think that we need to recognize as my thesis that punk comes actually from rock. First, there was rock, and then from rock, we moved to punk rock in the 60s, 70s, and then from there to punk. So it was not from rock to punk straight. There was a bridge in between, which is all these punk rock bands. First, we have the rock phenomena going on with bands like Black Sabbath, the Stooges, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles. This is a list of bands that many Mexicans were listening also in the 60s and 70s, like people were listening in the United States, or people were listening in England, or in Germany, or, Mexico was also listening to these bands. But Mexico had its own wrong culture developing, and Mexico was always keen to develop its own cultural expression. 68, this year, was incredibly important, not only for Mexicans, it was an incredibly emancipatory year also for Mexico. This year was incredibly important for France, for the Czech Republic, for the United States. It was a year of rebellion, the rebellion of the students, the rebellion of the young generations. And it was a year in which there was a huge need for change and rebellion. And this year had a solid social, cultural, and political movements within the country, also in the context of Mexico, in which you have the student movement, the workers' movement, intellectuals, but also musicians. So music has been incredibly relevant for any kind of emancipation in the cultural context, internationally talking. Now, back to punk in the context of Mexico, the question about how did punk actually arrive to Mexico? The answer is very, very fascinating, I find. It arrived via radio stations and music magazines, particularly through immigrant workers that were, crossing the border between Mexico and the United States, also via children of aristocrats traveling abroad. This is also an incredibly important phenomena. Again, not only in the context of Mexico, but for Mexico was also relevant. Not many Mexicans, particularly the working class, had the money or the resources to see punk culture in England or in the United States, but either the migrant people, the children of the migrant workers, or the aristocrats traveling abroad, were the people that could see what was going on in subcultures in another countries. And they were bringing materials back to Mexico, and they were bringing all these cultural inputs that they were having in other countries. Mexicans have an incredibly important cultural exchange within subcultures. And this has been happening since years. Like we always have this kind of intersections happening between, for instance, the goth culture with the metal culture, the punk culture, the rock culture. There has been always this kind of exchange happening, and that's Mexico is not an exception. I would like to go to what I call the class factor. Punk is a complex cultural entity with voices from working class subjects and rebellious rich kids. That's a thesis that I have. In the context of Mexico, this phenomenon was not different. First of all, we have rich and middle class kids stealing ideas from the working class and marketing punk as a capitalist product. That has been going on since the beginning of punk. There is always the rich kids that have knowledge on management, on marketing, on investment, and the money for making the investment. So they have been keen for the punk movement because they have been putting the resources for buying instruments, for renting studios, recording studios, for the printing of magazines, for the printing of records, and also like bringing the inputs to different contexts. A second point is that privileged kids traveling, dressing up, buying records and magazines, or investing in bands have been has played an important role for spreading punk internationally. They are a key figure for the movement. However, they also have been influenced by the working class, no? The working class, on one hand, they were accessing the music and the paraphernalia input from rich kids, but on the other hand, the working class people, the working class kids were influencing politically the rich kids, because the rich kids come in contact with poverty, with the struggles of the working class. They were also politicizing themselves. So there has been always this kind of ping pong influence going on between rich kids and poor kids. And at the end of the day, in the context of punk music, music has been breaking class borders. Why? Because at the end of the day, we are all punks. This does not mean that we should ignore the class factor. The class factor is incredibly relevant. Not everyone has access to the same things. And this has been a problem also in subcultures, that not everyone has the good clothing, not everyone has the good records, not everyone gets the wonderful contracts, you know. So that's something that we need to acknowledge also in the punk context. Another factor is what I call the language factor. In the context of Mexico, Mexicans speak mostly Spanish, and I am talking here about the urban context, big cities. However, Mexicans also speak still, 68 indigenous languages. Imagine 68 spoken indigenous languages still today. This happens because in the context of Mexico, even though that there was a colonization period, many of the indigenous groups, they went to the mountains and they hide in the mountains where Spaniards could not reach them. So there is a diversity that could keep over the years up until today, and they save all their culture and their cultural diversity and their languages as well. So we also have punk that is sung in different indigenous languages. Also, as part of the language factor is the fact that the Anglo-punk for Mexicans at the beginning, it was a language, there was a strong language border. Not mostly of Mexicans in the 70s, 80s, they did not speak English, so they could not really understand the lyrics of the Ramones or of the Sex Pistols, or even in the rock period, Black Sabbath, and so they had certain limitations in the context of language. Today is a very different thing, no? Through globalization and internet, and many Mexicans speak Spanglish sometimes, no, a lot of English and also different languages. But important is to say that in the context of Mexico, there are still indigenous spoken languages. Here I want to point out also to the influence of the Spanish anarchism. For instance, I place here a picture of La Polla Records, which is an anarchist punk band from North Spain. And they were like politicizing punks in Mexico because they have incredibly hot anarchist lyrics in Spanish that are incredibly understandable. And you could understand through these lyrics what exploitation, what racism, what capitalism meant. And they were fundamental for the politicization of the Mexican punks. So we also have this incredibly language with the Anglo corner, it was a border, but with the Spanish corner, it was a radical bridge to anarchism. And in this, what I mean by that is that the Mexican punk scene started to get incredibly politicized. And this is also thanks to the Spanish punk. Mexicans sang and sing in different languages. That's something that I can say proudly about Mexico, that Mexicans speak different languages. It is not only English, English, English all the time. No, there is also punk in Mixteco, in Nahuatl, in different indigenous languages, in Spanish, in English, and Spanglish. So Mexicans are incredibly broad in their language understanding of punk culture. The first punk generation, which is basically between the 70s and 80s, when we talk, I mentioned that before, that the first Mexican punks, or the phenomena of punk, come from rockers, no, from rock music. There was a transition from rock to punk rock. No? We have this local and international rock, but around 78, there was this radio station called Radio Juventud that at that time plays a track by the band called known as Television from the New York City scene. And that was incredibly important because there were some Mexicans in Mexico City listening to this radio. And when they got this first track play on the radio station, they were like, what is this type of music? What is this? And they were like incredibly curious to find out more punk rock bands. Also, there was this DJ called Sonido Violencia, also from New York City, who was invited to play punk in a party in El Barrio Nezahualcóyotl, which is basically a marginal zone, a working class neighborhood. And he went there to play all the tracks by the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, and the Clash. And this encounter between the New York punk scene and the working class marginal scene in Mexico City was incredibly important, because out of this encounter, out of this party, came the new punk, a new kind of scene in Mexico City, which was the punk rock scene, influenced by New Yorkers, basically by the punk rock New Yorkers that dare to play punk rock in a marginal zone. Once punk rock bands established commercially, magazines started to promote the bands via music articles, no? These promos, and the magazines were fundamental for the spread of punk culture. These magazines were flowing slowly across the country, and a scene started to build up. So on one hand was the radio stations, and on the other hand were the magazines. The first punk generation in the 70s and 80s, here I'm gonna name you a list of bands. I would love to play you each of them, but it will take too long. So, but you can see the names and then you can listen them online. There are tracks online that you can find. This is the 70s, 80s periods in the context of Mexico. We have a band called Dangerous Rhythm. They used to play actually many tracks in English, because when they listen to punk rock, like the Ramones, they try to kind of imitate this song singing in English. There is the Size, this band, very incredibly synth orientated and very influenced by the looks of I forgot at the moment, David Bowie. Also, Satellite City Punk Rockers. That's an incredibly important band, because the singer was a woman. And it was like very important for that period to have women on the at the front. This band, that's why it's very important. We have Hospital X. We have also one of the most famous Mexican punk bands called Rebel the Punk. We have also Desorden Público. We have Japs. Also, we have a band called Masacre 68, which it's the name says it all. It's talking about the 68 massacre that happened also in Mexico City. We have Secta Suicida Siglo XX, which is also incredibly important for the gender punk, because also the front singer was a woman who is still alive doing a lot of things. I will talk about her in a second. We also have the super famous Toxico band, Xenophobia, a Specimen from North Mexico, TNT, Hysteria. And these are, as I told you, you can research them on internet. You can find tracks by them on internet. Also, we have more in the period of the 80s and 90s. We have Herejía, Disolución Social, Psicodencia, Lucha Autónoma, which is a more anarchist-orientated band. We have Distorsión Clandestina. We have Desobediencia Civil. Desobediencia Civil is my generation, also like Lucha Autónoma. Desobediencia Civil is more for animal rights and veganism. And then you have Sedición, which is doing like kind of horror punk. And now I would like to play you a video about the Mexican scene. So let's listen to the video.
Hablar de punk siempre es algo hablar como de misa, algo como hablar de religión, ¿no? En realidad la música es como lo secundario, ¿no? Más la cosa que nos formó como punk fue como la calle, las necesidades, los problemas que había, y después de ahí empezamos a agarrar y escuchar música, ¿no?
Pues en sí el pogo sí es descargar esta ira.
Sentir la música corre así como que la sangre y te da así como, váyanse todos a la mierda y hoy voy a decir todo lo que pienso y lo que creo, lo que vivimos en el país.
El punk para mí es abrirte, no ponerte barreras, ¿no?
Muchas veces los punks adoptan esta idea anarquista. ¿Por qué? Por la idea de libertad, de luchar contra el sistema, este sistema capitalista que pues nos absorbe y nos pega a todos y mucho más a las clases que estamos abajo, ¿no?
Todas las canciones, toda la ideología, todo es para tener un mundo mejor. Y es lo que mucha gente nunca ha entendido del punk. Cuando hablan del punk a veces siempre lo lidian con gente rara o así, ¿no? Pero el punk en realidad como esencia, pues es amor, ¿no?
Of course, we can debate on if punk is love or not. I would like to say something about that. Of course, all the cultural expressions in the context of music have a lot to do with their history. And normally when we have a cultural expression that is, it happens always as a resonance to something that happened before. In the context of punk, there is no difference. Punk was also a reaction to the hippie movement in the 60s. That's why I gave you a little raw, very raw history about rock and the hippie movement in the 68 and Avándaro and Woodstock. And of course, punk was in its own way a reaction to these movements, because these movements were talking about no war. They were the anti-war movements against the war in Vietnam. And they were saying or approaching love. They were saying, we need love, we are love. That's the hippie movement. No, they were fighting for love. And then comes the punk culture, and the punk culture is basically saying, no, we don't want love. We hate, we hate all this hypocrisy going on in the hippie movement, because there was a lot going on after, many years after, many things were just falling apart in the hippie movement. You have the Manson massacre, and for many punks, they react to this movement with the opposite, which is hatred, rage, anger, frustration. And that's very interesting to see, I find, historically talking from our perspective today, because in the context of Mexico, the fact that punk was an expression of rage, for the context of Mexico, this rage was necessary, historically speaking. Why? Because Mexico has a lot of oppression, and punk culture has been an important way to deal with all the violence, the classism, the racism, and all the structures of oppression, heteronormativity. There has been a lot of ways in which Mexicans have been oppressed, particularly people of color, indigenous people, African people, because we have Mexicans with an African heritage. So when punk came to this context, it was just perfect, because it was the music that expressed all these pain and this resentment and this need for justice and this rage and this and you put on the on this formula, if you also put Spanish anarchism, I mean, it was a Molotov for the country. So in that sense, my thesis is that punk is a reaction to love with rage and anger. At the same time, is a movement that over the years also looks for love. But we need to understand, what do we mean by love? And what I mean by punk as a love expression is the fight for social justice, is the fight for better payments for workers, is the fight for legal abortions for women, is the fight for solidarity among indigenous people, Afro subjects, people of color. Is all these intersectional struggles. That's for me what love means. The solidarity for all the people that have been put in prison because they are fighting for human rights. You know, that's what I think we understand as love in the punk culture. That is like love in the sense of stop the violence and the structural oppression towards all these subjects that have been oppressing centuries. So that's the interpretation that I give when we talk about punk as love. Is what I mean by that is punk as social justice. I want to go now to the heart of the punk exchange in Mexico City, where I come from. There is this place called El Chopo. The official name is Tianguis Cultural del Chopo, which was born in the 80s. This market is today, it's still running, it's very big, it became quite commercial, I mean, quite big. But at the time, in the 80s, it was a place that began actually as a cultural activity run by a university. This university, La UNAM, it's in a museum, which is called Museo del Chopo. But this university is an humanistic, progressive, and emancipatory university that has opened so many platforms for culture and rebellion. And one of these is this market called El Mercado del Chopo, located in Mexico City. This place has become a place for cultural socialization, for networking, for DIY production, and basically a place for subculture, in which you do exchange, but you also sell your products. Or if you're a musician and have a record, you can go there and sell your record, or you produce T-shirts. I think today it has become a little bit more commercial and therefore more problematic. But in the past, it was an excellent place to go. I remember that if you wanted to have the paraphernalia, the fashion, if you wanted to buy a record or a tape or a copy, that was the place to go. Also to know where the bands were playing, where the concerts were. El Chopo has been always a place where you can get information, you can get books, you can get music, you can get clothing, you can meet new people, you can hang out. So this place has been keen for the punk culture in Mexico City, but not only for punk, also for all type of subcultures like the metal culture, the ska culture, the rock culture, of course. So you have all this type of cultural music, cultural expressions that have been meeting in this market. So if you ever go to Mexico City and you're part of the subcultures, this is the place to go, El Mercado del Chopo. Intersectional struggles. In the context of Mexico, we have different struggles going on. I assume that you have already thought about it during the conference. We have like the gender, the class, and the race issues and struggles happening in the context of Mexico. When we talk about punk, we talk also about the resistance and the struggles. And one of them in the context of Mexico is the gender-based violence within the punk scene, but also in general in the society. And this has been a struggle that women have been doing since the beginning of punk, starting with the fact that women wanted to be punk as well, and they were dressing up and they were going to shows. And at the beginning, they first were like the girlfriend of the boy, the girlfriend of the singer in the band. But as you saw with the bands that I present to you before, they were already two bands from the beginning and the second generation of women at the front of the bands singing. And not only that, many of them became hardcore activists of the punk scene, representing the punk scene in Mexico City and in different regions across the country. We have also the struggle for the right of abortion. We have the struggles against racism towards indigenous groups. This struggle is incredibly relevant in the context of Mexico because we still have a lot of indigenous people that are living and that are completely oppressed. So many punks are organizing the struggles in solidarity with these groups. And also many of these indigenous groups or many people coming from indigenous groups, better to say, they have become punks themselves and they have been representing the indigenous people in the punk context. We also have the struggle, the struggle against the patriarchal status quo, the military and police brutality. We also have struggles in solidarity with political prisoners, and we have the struggle for animal and environmental justice. Just to give you some examples, this type of intersectional struggles belong to the punk culture in the context of Mexico. It's not only like a music and that's it, a DJ or a band just playing. In the context of Mexico, we're talking about emancipatory practice. And that's very important to see that Mexico is not just, looking good or no, they have really strong messages and a strong activism going on. Now I want to talk about the Mexican punk, some Mexican punk emancipatory examples, because as I just mentioned, Mexico is not just about, the music, it's about the cultural change and the social change. So I want to point out to some subjects that have been doing a strong emancipation in the context of the Mexican punk scene. And one of them it's very funny, is this guy called Ricardo Mestre, who is the founder of the Biblioteca Social Reconstruir. This man, Ricardo Mestre, comes from the CNT in Spain, the National Confederation of Labor and Anarcho-Syndicalism Labor Unions. He used to be a judge for working for the Workers' Network, and he's from Barcelona. And from Barcelona, he moved to Mexico City with a book of anarchist archive. So he found this biblioteca, which is a library. And this library that has all his books and many other books, because it has expanded over the years through donations. This library is still operating today, runs by the solidarity of the people, and it holds, in the context of Mexico and Latin America, the international anarchist knowledge. What he did, he brought the knowledge to Mexico and he started like spreading the knowledge. And Ricardo Mestre used to give workshops on anarchism, and he taught many Mexican punks what anarchism actually meant. And of course, many people really listened to him because there was a lot of oppression going on. So the relationship between Mexico and Spain is not only painful, it is also revolutionary and beautiful. And one example of the beauty is Ricardo Mestre. And this space operates still today in solidarity with many political groups. And the guy that you see on your right, his name is Toby. Toby has been operating as a representative of this library, promoting anarchist knowledge in Mexico, within the country, across the country, but also representing Mexico in other countries. And unfortunately, he passed away of COVID last year. And he was giving conferences in the United States, and as a Mexican visitor, I don't know how he got there. I don't know if he was legal or illegal, but he did not have access to doctors, and he died of COVID. Rest in peace, of course. Another emancipatory punk example is the case of two women from the punk scene, the gender-based resistance. One of them is La Zapa, and the other one is Magos Punk. You can see them in this picture in the middle. Zapa, she used to be the singer of this band that I presented to you before, Kyle Secta Suicida Siglo XX. In 89, she was the vocalist of that band, and she has been the vocalist of different bands. She still plays today in different bands, and she also works together with Magos Punk, and they both run a collective and a scene called La Menstruación de Rebeca. They give a lot of online visibility to different struggles, including the gender-based violence struggle. And they also try to bring awareness to women and men. They don't focus only on the gender struggle in the sense of dividing struggles, but what they are trying to do is bringing men and women together, because they both at the end of the day are oppressed. So what they are trying to do is kind of bring an harmonious interaction between men and women, and they try to overcome gender issues. So they are not like the typical, but some of the typical cliches of a feminist that supposed to hate men. They don't. What they do is more like working on building up bridges with men, educating men, and trying to work together and trying to find common places for emancipation. And I think that's very beautiful of them, because as older generations, they understand that as feminists, you cannot promote hatred towards men. That's incredibly not fruitful and reasonable, because at the end of the day, men are also oppressed by patriarchy. And I think that we all together can build a better future. And La Zapa and Magos understand that, and they give a lot of talks, solidarity talks on gender issues, gender violence, but also to men. They approach men in order to build the bridge post-gender politics, basically. Another punk emancipatory example is the case of El Picos. He is from Ecatepec, and he is a person that has been working for years, for decades, in the context of street children. And what he does is basically he does flyers, DIY promotion. He speaks to different punk collectives, and he asks people to donate clothing that they don't need. So there's a lot of recycling involved, but also like food that people can donate. And what he does is he organizes people, he cooks food, and he brings clothing, food, and toys for the unfortunate, for particularly like street children that have nothing. They have basically nothing. And he comes to them, he brings them, particularly during Christmas. And I think this is a very beautiful thing coming out of the punk culture. It's just basically subjects, specific subjects that change the world with their actions. So it's not just about being cool, it's a bit acting cool. It's a lot of action going on with these Mexican punks. Another example of punk emancipatory praxis is also the case of Lord Fair. Lord Ferd, he runs a space called Real Onda in Mexico City as a collective, not him alone. He runs it as a collective with other people. He's also a teacher teaching mixed martial arts. He has a school that he also organized with a collective of people. And this school is for self-defense. They give workshops also to women, which is, as you might imagine, in Mexico, there is a lot of patriarchal violence towards women, but also a lot of, there has been a lot of discriminatory violence towards subcultures. No, if you look punk, or if you look goth, or if you look different metal, people will attack you. The police, the militaries, people that are very conservative, particularly if you're a woman. So his battle is basically on self-defense. But also he's a very famous DJ, and he works in the intersection between punk and goth culture. And I want to finish this conference with the last punk emancipatory example, which is the case of Martín Sorrondegay. He is not Mexican. However, he has influenced Mexico in such an amazing ways, but not only Mexico, also the whole Latin America and the Latino culture in the United States, with his band Los Crudos, and also with his more contemporary project called Limgrist. His battle, his struggle, is more in the sense of the Latino and gay pride in the US and in Latin America. He has been doing a lot of what is called the homocore and queercore against macho heteronormativity and homophobic punk. I really respect this person because over the years, he has been opening bridges and opening particularly doors to the LGBTQ plus subjects within the punk culture, in particularly and specifically in the context of hardcore music. As you know, hardcore music can be a variant of punk music that is has been incredibly patriarchal and homophobic and macho orientated. However, he has been like making a strong battle for gay culture, for homosexuals, and I think that has been a very legitimate battle, because today we have to be inclusive, and we have to consider that many of our subjects in pop culture are basically post-gender and homosexuals and pansexuals and bisexuals, and we need to be inclusive and to approach punk in different ways, and to acknowledge the different struggles that the punk culture has. And for me, this conference is basically to show you what is possible and what has been possible in the context of Latin America, basically in the context of Mexico. And there is a lot going on still today. And I feel very, very honored to talk about it and share the experiences and the knowledge that I have to you. And I really hope that you enjoy the conference. And I welcome you to explore more, and particularly the bands that I present to you. And yes, I hope, and I wish that you explore a little bit more Mexico and its emancipatory expressions. And also, I hope that you enjoy this short conference where I was talking about Mexico and its BIPOC realities and all the resistance that has been going on there. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the conference. Bye-bye.